Hello, this is Dr. Flight, and this is a short lecture that will focus on clustering methods within the cluster analysis process. So to start with, there are going to be two fundamentally different and usable methods in which to arrive at a clustering solution. One will be what's called a non-hierarchical, and the other one will be hierarchical. So basically the approach when we talk about hierarchical and non-hierarchical regression or cluster analysis focuses on how the clusters are initially formed and the process that they go through and that we go through in doing so. And mostly hierarchical regression is, or cluster analysis, I've done that twice now. Hierarchical cluster analysis is done where an unknown number of clusters is formed initially. A lot of times with hierarchical or non-hierarchical cluster analysis, the number of clusters is predetermined. So that'll be a differentiating factor here. The other thing is, though, to know about cluster methods is oftentimes clusters are formed using several methods, and an analysis of both methods is used. Sometimes we do hierarchical clustering and then non-hierarchical after as a confirmatory step. So know this, that non-hierarchical clustering methods are preferred when the number of clusters is known in advance. The other element here is when clustering is done, typically observations are entered into the system and then distances are calculated, and then new observations are entered and new distances are entered, and so on and so forth. So this is an iterative process where data is analyzed, reanalyzed, analyzed again, and on and on and on. So there is an idea of what's called a seed point, which would be a starting point for the iterations to begin with. So this is something that could be specified, or it could be designed by the software that you're using as well. We know that outliers can be a concern. However, in non-hierarchical methods, outliers and the influence of them may be less severe. So they're not as sensitive then. Non-hierarchical methods are not as sensitive to outliers. We also are going to introduce something called a distance measure irrelevant variables, which is one of the pre-assumptions in the preliminary setup, is something to be less concerned about in non-hierarchical methods. And again, this notion of a seed point or a starting point where by distances are initially measured are less impacted by non-hierarchical methods. Moving forward, we can talk a little bit about hierarchical methods. And essentially, a hierarchical method is one where an observation is added every step and throughout a series of sequential steps or iterations, these observations are grouped and regrouped and grouped again. So it's a step-by-step, kind of like a stepwise approach if we were to think about regression, where in stepwise regression we add variables that are meaningful. In hierarchical regression, we usually add observations. So sometimes we'll take two observations that are statistically close to each other and group them together. Then we'll add a third variable and see if it groups or whether it forms its own group, and then the fourth variable, and then the fifth, and so on and so forth. So hierarchical regression is just a different method that the software uses to form the clusters that we will ultimately look at and observe. So again, there are a wide range of clustering methods that are available, especially in hierarchical regression, so a lot of things that we can specify. And it also will be helpful to accept a large number of samples or observations. Okay, so moving on and talking about some other things, going back to non-hierarchical cluster analysis. Non-hierarchical clustering methods require that the number of clusters that we are going to specify be identified in advance before running the procedure. Now, there are a number of different ways that the procedure will move forward in a non-hierarchical method or process. One is a sequential threshold method, where the observations that are closest to a cluster are entered and then cannot leave that cluster. They can't be moved around. A parallel threshold, where we have several seed points starting simultaneously, so several clusters all at once are developed simultaneously, and then an optimizing procedure, which does allow for observation reassignment after a number of iterations. So, so again, non-hierarchical clustering. The analogy may be the simultaneous entry method for regression analysis, when we enter all variables all at the same time and run an analysis. And hierarchical cluster analysis would be analogous to the stepwise approach, if you will, by in a regression type of a setting. And that sort of is a description of how these two may deviate from each other. So when we talk about seeding then, and non-hierarchical methods, we first have to specify where the centroid or cluster seed will start. And then based on that start point, we look at the distance between observations and that center or that seed point. So it'd be similar to a centroid, the centroid notion that we have maybe in discriminant analysis, where we have a grouping and then we take the center point of the grouping, and the question is, where would that center point be to start? That would be the seed. It may be a case where you identify that in advance because of some former research that you've done, or you let SPSS or your data software assign that initial start point as it is. One other method here, or that I want to mention, is that a combination of methods can be used in cluster analysis. So again, I mentioned it already that you may begin with a non-hierarchical arrangement or a hierarchical arrangement to begin with, and then try a different method, measure or method or approach just to confirm that. There is also a method called a two-step cluster. And in a two-step cluster, basically what happens is the data observations are assigned a cluster like you would in a non-hierarchical approach. And then the data is rerun using a hierarchical approach to confirm the membership of the observations to the clusters. So two-step cluster approaches then are advantageous in that respect. The other big advantage of a two-step cluster approach is that you're allowed to use metric or non-metric data. So dichotomous data or nominal or ordinal type of data, as opposed to strictly metric data, which would be required in the other methods. The other thing to know is in hierarchical regression, you need to have standardized data. So a lot of times this process will begin with standardizing your data to begin with. So just keep in mind that that may be done, but in a two-step cluster approach, sometimes the there's a little bit more leniency, if you will, on what's required of the data. So getting back then, we talked a little bit about hierarchical and non-hierarchical in terms of the two different formats, and getting back again to the hierarchical approach. And admittedly here, the hierarchical approach requires more specification from the data from you as the researcher in terms of how the data will be set up. Non-hierarchical approaches like the k-means approach really doesn't require you to input a lot of information in order to run the analysis, and a two-stage approach is even less, quite frankly. It's very straightforward to be able to do. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about hierarchical approaches. So we start with our observations, each of which is their own cluster. So just imagine that every observation you have is your own cluster. And then what happens is the software will typically choose the two observations which are most similar to each other. And those two that are most similar to each other forms a cluster. And now that one cluster has two observations instead of one. This will repeat and continue until all of the observations have been placed into a cluster, and that each cluster has a single center. Okay, so here we have observation 1 and observation 2, which have fallen together. Then we have other observations. Observation 3 does not directly go into here until this next stage, if you will, this fourth stage or fourth iteration. Meanwhile, while these first iterations are going on, so we had 1 and 2 go together. Then in the next stage we had 5 and 6 go together. And then in the next stage, we had 7 join 5 and 6. In the fourth stage, we had 3 join 1 and 2. In the fifth stage, we had 8 join the 5, 6, and 7. In the sixth stage, it looks like we had number 4 join the 1, 2, and 3, and so on. And so this is the method, and this is called a dendrogram, and this is a depiction of the similarities and how observations group together through a step-by-step process until all of the observations have a home and that the centers or clusters are well defined. So with all the data here, then we would have 2 clusters which absorb all of the data that's available, and go from there. We do not want any single item clusters. We really don't want any clusters that just have small membership numbers either relative to the rest. Okay, so that's kind of the hierarchical approach as opposed to the non-hierarchical approach, which again would take all of the data and put it into the system together simultaneously, and then go from there. This is definitely a step-by-step approach. Now, 2 things that we need to define when we're doing hierarchical clusters. One will be the similarity method, which is used to group the different data points. So there will be different approaches again to finding which observations most naturally go together. There's the furthest neighbor, the nearest neighbor, average between and within the groups. So those are actually 2 within the same category here, average, between, or within groups, the centroid method, and the Ward's method. So similarity measures calculate across entire sets of clustering variables that allow for the groupings of the observations and their comparison to each other. So this is the method in which we tell which items are closer, which observations are closer or further apart from each other. The second thing that we look at or think about is the distance, the way the measures are measured, the way the distances are measured. So if we got two observations that are near each other and we're choosing them first, that's the nearest neighbor, also called the single linkage. But the other question is, well, how do we calculate distance? And there are a whole number of different ways to calculate distance. So there's the Euclidean squared, Mahalanobis, and so on and so forth. So there's actually lots of different ways to either choose by method or choose by distance how the clusters will be formed in a hierarchical sense. Okay, so the nearest neighbor, or the single linkage, is probably the most versatile method or algorithm, but it poorly delineates cluster structures within the data, and sometimes they're hard to interpret. Snake-like chains in the dendrogram can be problematic. The furthest neighbor eliminates this chaining problem. So the graphical display that was identified earlier in the dendrogram image, if there's a series of linkages that become created in your output, sometimes the furthest neighbor approach helps clean that up a little bit. But as opposed to the closest neighbors, the closest variables or observations being linked, what this does is it bases clustering on distances, like further distance, observations that are further apart. Other methods include the between and within group methods, where we deal with clusters that have small variance versus clusters that have large. So ideally we want to form clusters, and the observations that fall within the cluster, then if it's a between group one, then we want to minimize. We want to minimize the cluster, the observation distance within these individual clusters. Average within and between group methods, they're based on average similarity of individuals. So this is actually somewhat similar to the last between group method that we just spent a second talking about. But these clusters this method tends to generate clusters with small within variation, and they tend to be less affected by outliers if you use this particular method. Finally, there's the centroid method and then the Ward's method. So the centroid method it measures the distance between cluster centroids, and like average linkages is less affected by outliers. So that is a plus. However, the results may indeed be difficult to identify. And the Ward's method is based on the total sum of squares within clusters, and it's fairly appropriate to use this method if you expect fairly evenly sized clusters. Outliers, however, can impact the Ward's method more so than the other methods as well. Some graphical displays of these based on some fictitious data can help illustrate how some of these methods look and act in terms of grouping the data together. So here we have some sample data, and we might think that maybe these go together and maybe these go together, and I don't know, maybe these and maybe these. It's hard to tell, of course, but we would want the data to help drive us. We have two variables, variable 1 and variable 2, and if we move forward and we take a look at what some of these approaches may look like, they'll be based roughly off of the agglomeration schedule. So when we look at the agglomeration schedule, and this will be a table that's reported within our results. This will take us stage by stage through the hierarchical process. So at stage 1, what this is saying, this schedule here actually uses nearest neighbor approach, where it analyzing the data, observation 11 and 12 were both were found to have the smallest distance among the variables that were entered, and so the distance was the smallest between them, and so they grouped together. So they grouped together to form their own cluster. Then what happens is the software takes the next variables that are closest together, and it happens that there are 2 that are equally distant. So 5 and 7 are close, and 1 and 3 are close. And so what it does is so now we have these 3 clusters that are formed together. And now we're going to start combining these, and we take observation 9. Now the way this works is we see 11 here and we see 11 here. So 11 represents this first cluster that was formed. 9 is the next closest, has the association, and the association is with the cluster that 11 is in. So in other words, observation 9 is going to fall into the 11 and 12 cluster. And that is the next closest linkage that's taking place. So we're not forming a new cluster. What we're doing is putting 9 into that original cluster that was made. So we still only have 3 clusters, and so that's how that's working. 2 and 4 are clustering together. 1 and 6 are clustering together. Now 8 is going into 9. Well, we had 9 just a second ago, so 9 is going to go into this, or 8 is going into the cluster that 9, 11, and 12 are in. So they are continuing to form a cluster there. So that's the process. Now we can also follow along in the next stage category here, or column. So 11 and 12 formed a cluster, and the next stage that they appear is 4. So we go to 4 and we see 11 is here. Number 2, the second, when we have 5 and 7 which formed, the next stage that they come in is 8. So we actually have 5 and 7. 5 is right here, and actually 2 goes into 5 and 7. 2 appeared here before. So 2 and 2, so this cluster and this cluster go together. So this is confusing, I understand, but this is the agglomeration schedule, and it sort of, if you read it, it tells a story about how the observations were brought together. This is actually something that's also described. These numbers here, and this distance and this grouping is also graphically, this is the graphic representation that the dendrogram provides. So when we see this in table form, the dendrogram actually illustrates it in chart form. All right, moving on and finishing up here, just to give you some graphical examples. We use the nearest neighbor approach. Then what we're going to do again is we're going to look for the smallest groupings here. So the first smallest grouping is this one here. The second smallest grouping is this one here. The third is here. And then our fourth has these coming together, right? These coming together. So these would be the observations that we saw from the agglomeration schedule, where these were the first two that formed, second two, third two, and then in that fourth stage, remember we had a variable come into a cluster, so that came into there, and by doing that, the cluster was redefined. The furthest neighbor approach, again, like we'll look for distances that are greater, and the approach will actually maybe be more complete here. So number 1 goes here. Number 2 is the same. Number 3 is the same. Number 4, though, sees these two together. Number 5 sees these guys together up here, and then continues on. So it will actually look for ones that are on the outside and the outskirts and bring them in. And it'll be a little bit more of a complete clustering approach as it moves forward. Okay, so the shortest, which is the neighbor approach, the furthest neighbor, closest neighbor, sometimes they're called single linkages versus complete linkages. So the single link looks to distance these guys apart between clusters, all right? And then the furthest would take a grouping, and it would look to maximize this distance. So we're maximizing the closest group or maximizing the furthest apart. That's the way that would work. All right, now I'm saying all this, and you really don't see any of this in the analysis or in the output or whatever. These are graphical representations that are happening. Averages within and averages between groups. So we're looking for dissimilarities across groups here. We're looking for strong inter-item agreement in the average within group process. And then finally, we have the Ward's sum of squares, and then the centroid neighbor approach, where we take averages of small groups and compare them to the distances here. So instead of having this distance and this distance, we have the average of the two for the centroid. And what we're doing is we're actually creating centroids, and we're looking at the distance apart from them. Okay, the distance apart. Right, and so again, lots of different methods here. One of the conclusions is to use several different approaches. When we look at these distances, again, there are several different ways to measure distance. So listed here, then, the Euclidean distance is oftentimes used. The squared Euclidean distance is used and recommended when you use the centroid and Ward's methods. The Mahalanobis distance is a possibility, but especially when there's intercorrelated variables. However, SPSS does not conveniently allow you to do this. Do this method. So again, we'll look at SPSS options as well that are there. So finally, when we look at this process, the clustering process will leave the researcher with decisions to make in terms of how many clusters to use and which ones are most appropriate. Okay, so that will be the question that we have, and you may be forced with something like this where there's a two cluster solution, and this was created using the nearest neighbor and the centroid approach. So if you look at this is not a very helpful clustering solution, because this is a single cluster, single observation cluster, which we would dismiss, and then you're only left with one group. So that doesn't really help us. And so in this case, the nearest and the centroid method was not very helpful. Rather, when we went a two cluster solution, if we chose the furthest within between the Ward's method or a non-hierarchical method opposed to a hierarchical method, those methods would reveal this type of a solution where we have one clear cluster up here and then a second clear cluster down here, and they're definable and usable. So here's a case where the method that we used had a huge impact on the actual clusters that were formed and whether they would be useful to us or not. So again, try several methods. Okay, other examples here, we have a between and the centroid methods giving us, we specified 3, or we looked at 3 clusters. However, these 3 are not usable. This one is probably, and this one is, but this one really is not. This one is not. These 2 may be usable, so that's not a bad thing. But if we go with a 3-factor or a 3-cluster solution, the furthest within and Ward's, and again the non-hierarchical, again in this case was the best. It really demonstrates 3 unique clusters that have been identified, and ones that we can use to do a further analysis with. So the cluster type, the method of clustering absolutely matters, and you can play around and try a lot of different techniques here. So different methods may produce entirely different solutions. That's a big conclusion I want you to have. Several different methods using different numbers of clusters then are important, and importantly, you've got to be able to interpret your results. If you can't interpret the cluster, then it's advised to continue, redo the work, and try some more options out there. Okay, so this is then a discussion, an overview, if you will, on some of the technical details of non-hierarchical versus hierarchical clustering methods, and also the 2-step clustering method, which combines sort of both attempts. Remember, the non-hierarchical method is more like a simultaneous approach to entering observations, while the hierarchical method requires you to specify more details in the process, the method and the distance in particular that's going to be used, but it also uses a step-by-step iterative approach to forming the cluster centers and clusters themselves. Okay, so good luck with this. Have fun running your data and examining clusters using different approaches. Obviously, feel free to ask questions. I look forward to touching base with you and getting to hear feedback from you on cluster analysis.